The United States Navy's submarine war against the Empire of Japan technically began the moment the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. It is a date etched in infamy, a moment of sudden, blinding violence that shattered the peace of a Sunday morning and plunged the world into its darkest era. But to say the war started there, amid the smoke and the sinking battleships, is only half the truth. Practically speaking, the men of the silent service had been gearing up for this specific fight for decades. In the quiet, dusty offices of naval planners and the cramped control rooms of training vessels, the war against Japan had been fought in theory 1,000 times before a single shot was fired in anger. The smoke cleared over the trenches of World War I. American strategists had been staring at the map of the Pacific. They had studied the lessons of the Kaiser's U-boat campaigns with obsessive detail. They saw how a handful of submersible killers, operating with ruthlessness and stealth, had nearly starved the British Empire into submission. They saw the fragility of island nations. The U.S. Navy looked at those lessons, then turned their gaze to the rising sun in the east. They realized their next great opponent would likely be another island empire, one utterly reliant on imported resources to feed its people and fuel its war machine. The target was Japan. The goal was simple but ambitious: to cut the economic jugular of an empire, to strangle it from beneath the waves. The planners drew their problem, a problem of sheer, terrifying scale. Themselves is big. To borrow a phrase from a future era, it is Douglas Adams-style big. It is a vast, blue emptiness that defies human comprehension. In the 1920s, naval planners were staring at a logistical nightmare. The U.S. mainland was thousands of miles away from Japan and the critical trade routes the empire would exploit. If, unlike the German U-boats, which could slip out of pens in Kiel or Lorient and be hunting in the shipping lanes of the Atlantic within days, American submarines faced a marathon just to get to the starting line. They had to traverse an ocean before they could even think about engaging the enemy. If you wanted a submarine to operate against Japan for more than 5 minutes before running out of fuel and heading home, you couldn't just build a bigger boat. You needed a new breed of boat entirely. You needed a machine that balanced endurance, speed, and lethality in a way that had never been done before. And so, as the world moved steadily toward the precipice of 1941, the stage was set. The blueprints were finalized. The crews were drilled in the art of the approach. But as the sun rose on that Sunday morning in December, the U.S. submarine force was about to discover that their greatest enemy wasn't just the destroyers and aircraft of the Imperial Japanese Navy. It was their own bureaucracy, their own faulty weapons, and a peacetime doctrine that was about to be shattered by the brutal, bloody reality of total war. This is the story of those dark, early days. It is a story of broken machines, broken codes, and the men who held the line in the crushing depths when everything else was falling apart. To truly understand the disaster and the heroism that defined the U.S. submarine war in the opening months, you first have to understand the machines themselves. The submarine is a vessel defined by compromise, but the American fleet submarine was defined by the tyranny of geography. Familiarity distance of the Pacific dictated every rivet and every valve. A submarine built for the shallow, choppy waters of the North Sea or the clear depths of the Mediterranean, small, agile, quick diving, was utterly useless here. The U.S. Navy needed fleet submarines. These leviathans were designed to act as scouts for the main battle fleet, capable of 20 knots on the surface to keep pace with battleships, yet possessing the range to cross an ocean and the endurance to stay on patrol for weeks at a time without support. This necessity birthed the famous Gato class and its immediate predecessors like the Tambor and Salmon classes. These were large, expensive, complex machines. They were the spaceships of their day, packed with the most advanced technology America could produce. They prioritized reliability over cutting-edge experimentalism, Or, at least, that was the idea. Because if a main engine piston snapped or a compressor failed 3,000 miles from Pearl Harbor, help wasn't coming. You couldn't radio for a tow. You might as well have been on the surface of Mars. Because of their size and complexity, they were incredibly expensive. And because they were expensive, Congress, clutching the national purse strings tight during the lean years of the Great Depression, ensured there were never enough of them. The precise number calculated by strategists to effectively blockade Japan was 144 submarines. The Navy had nowhere near that number when the war began. But these boats had something the older World War I-era subs didn't. Starting in 1936, the Navy began installing a feature that seemed like an unimaginable luxury to the sailors of other nations: air conditioning. Discontent. Now, before you think of comfort, understand the reality of submarine warfare in the tropics. In the warm waters of the South Pacific, a submerged submarine is essentially a steel pressure cooker. The heat from the engines, the batteries, and the bodies of the crew has nowhere to go. Without cooling, the interior temperature and humidity would rise to lethal levels, turning the boat into a sweatbox where men would drop from heat stroke, and mold would grow on every surface within hours. But the Navy didn't install AC just for the sailors. They did it for the computers. The new fire control systems, the torpedo data computers, were the analog brains required to calculate complex firing solutions. They were filled with delicate gears, cams, and electrical contacts. If the boat was dripping with condensation, those circuits would short out in minutes, rendering the submarine toothless. The air conditioning kept the electronics dry, and as a happy side effect, it kept the crew from dying of exhaustion. Yet for all these technological marvels, there was a rot at the core of the service. It wasn't in the steel, it was in the mindset. Severe budget restrictions had created a culture of extreme caution. A submarine captain in peacetime wasn't judged on his aggression, his tactical innovation, or his willingness to take risks. He was judged on his ability not to break the expensive equipment. During the famous fleet problem exercises, the rules were rigged against aggression. A captain who executed a brilliant close-range attack but was theoretically detected by a destroyer would be reprimanded for endangering his boat. Meanwhile, a captain who stayed passive, hid on the bottom, and did absolutely nothing but remained undetected was commended for his prudence. The Navy was inadvertently breeding a generation of skippers who were technically proficient at operating a submarine, but terrified of actually fighting one. They were trained to rely purely on sonar, to stay deep, and to fire from long range where the math was safe, but the hits were unlikely. As the war clouds gathered in 1941, a few forward-thinking admirals realized this was a recipe for disaster. They saw that the war would not be a polite exercise, but before they could change the culture, before they could retrain the captains to be killers rather than technicians, the clock ran out. The theories, the drills, and the budget fights ended abruptly at 7:55 a.m. And for the submarines at sea, the war began not with a glorious counterattack, but with mass confusion and near-suicidal friendly fire. On the morning of December 7th, the submarine USS Pompano, along with her sisters Plunger and Pollock, were slicing through the surface swells of the Pacific, just a few hours out from Pearl Harbor. They were returning from a long transit from San Francisco. The crews were tired, the boats were salt-crusted, and they were running late due to bad weather. All thoughts were on shore leave, fresh food, and mail from home. At 08:17, the radio crackled with a message that defied belief. Air raid, Pearl Harbor, this is not drill. The psychological shift was instantaneous. The relaxed atmosphere of a Sunday morning evaporated. The crews frantically pumped out water ballast to lighten the boats, pushing the diesels to their limits to maximize surface speed, rushing toward the burning harbor to defend the fleet. But as they approached Oahu, reality set in. The fog of war isn't a metaphor, it is a state of mind, a blinding confusion where friend and foe become indistinguishable. Just over an hour later, a lone minute of air-raided boats going on, the next things to begin. The submarine metatrophiscian, they refet the sense of crossed. The crews provide the climate cruise and wish the grues. Just over an hour later, they lot with complicated for friend and foe. The grues were comblest to devent true the buddy of become. These message main defined provide the radio the 200% of war where the crews were dealing. But all the way at the daily properly want to get the sense of cross to not and eat the boats. The friends of the war, they replayed the scent and assumed to the boats. The crews replaced in the fand and the dale was to vent the death. Multiple response about the immediately album selves. The semper things were truling blood and the fleet to friend. The fog of war, they were taking the mental friends where friend and foe become invacridly. Just over an hour later, a lone menative clips of leaders state to take money the north available. Just over an hour later, a lone menative people heaven. The truel returned the daily properly difference of crossed. The grues were shrouded in many of them, and they just people to fend the complication with available. The touching the boats could blitted to reach the boats for the weather as well. The crews were placed in the met, they followed the vent. The submarine the truels were procrastinate, they set his black on. The crews were splanked to the boat, they caped into the boats. The crews were placed on the boats where great were placed medically. The sense of cross of the boat was socially just to the boat that they want to do them. The crews were protected to the medical self and they lift below. The road as den was strong with pronountial for one. The crews were protected they weren't be on the boats. The truels were provide them to say the submarine was one together. The primary for men was a floyerly, and the metal self and space which made admentation to be possible. With the time we said both origin, they were placed in the boats. The crews were protected to the medical self. The crews were protected to the medical self, they said from them. The crews were provide them to different self. They played in the boats were proposably one together. They continue to picture at the boat that it meant they makes them. The crews were protected to the medical self. The crews were protected to the medical self. They continue to picture at the boats. The crews were protected to the medical self. The crews were expected and the boats were intelligent and not in the boats. The crews were placed in the boats. The crews were in the boats were provide them to defend the boats. The crews were provide them to medical self were proposably one together. They played in the boats were proposable one together. The crews were placed in the boats were provide them to be in a view, which is the problem to the road. The crews were made to fit of the boat where they abide them to take money the north available. The crews were provide them to met it together. They continue to picture at the boats. The crews were provide them to medical self were provide them to be follow to the road. The crews were expected to the medical self. They said from them to the road. The crews were provide them to be in a view, which is the problem to the road. The crews were provide them to be follow to the road. The crews were provide them to be in a view, which is the problem to the road. The crews were provide them to be follow to the road. The crews were provide them to be definitely to be follow to the road. The crews were in emptiments in questions is that whether to believe the crews. The crews were provide them to medical self were provide them to be in a view, which is the problem to the road. The crews were provide them to be potentially with the crews. The crews were respected to the medical self were provide them to be mutter about them. The crews were provide them to be make the road and the late by the road. The crews were provide them to be soffable at the load. Siblings, an hour later, a lone aircraft appeared above the Pompano. Stabilized Bonneau spotted the plane and initiated an emergency dive. But the boat was heavy with fuel and supplies. The trim was wrong. The heavy submarine pitched forward, the angle becoming steep and dangerous, nearly heeling over completely. Men, tools, and loose gear were thrown against the bulkheads. They barely regained control before hitting the crushing depths. The nearby plunger looked up, saw the aircraft, and made a fatal assumption. They decided it was probably friendly, a U.S. Navy plane coming to guide them in. They stayed on the surface, waving. Were wrong. The aircraft was a Japanese scout, likely assessing the damage or checking alternate anchorages. It banked sharp and strafed the plunger, heavy machine gun bullets ricocheting off the pressure hull, forcing the crew to scramble for cover. The division commander, on board one of the subs, was in a state of shock. Perhaps it was denial, or perhaps the inability to process that the world had changed so quickly. He refused to believe it was enemy action. He wouldn't even signal the aircraft's location to the fleet. convinced it was all a terrible misunderstanding with a trigger-happy American pilot. It was absolute tautog was fighting for her life while still docked. Her crew manhandled a single 50-caliber machine gun, firing desperately at swarming Zeros and Val dive bombers that were turning the harbor into an inferno. Back at sea, the Pompano was now falling apart under the strain. Her engines, already temperamental, began to fail. And then, an actual U.S. Navy aircraft did appear. But in the hysteria of the morning, the American pilot looked down, saw a submarine silhouette, assumed it was Japanese, and attacked. These fueled, fully armed, and terrified. The U.S. subs spent the next few days dodging their own countrymen as often as the enemy. Be until December 9th that this small squadron finally limped into Pearl Harbor. The sights that greeted them silenced the crews. The twisted, smoking metal of the battleships, the black oil coating the water inches thick, the smell, a sickening mix of burning fuel, cordite, and death. It was a sobering realization that the rules of the game had not just changed, they had been obliterated. But while Pearl Harbor burned, thousands of miles away, a lonely, ancient Leviathan was about to have the first true surface interaction of the submarine war. The USS Argonaut was cruising off Midway Island. She was a relic, a massive, slow, clumsy mine layer converted to a patrol sub. When the Japanese bombardment force arrived to shell Midway, Argonaut was there. She spotted 2 Japanese destroyers. This was the moment. But here, the peacetime training kicked in. The Argonaut stayed deep. She stayed cautious. She didn't press the attack. The Japanese destroyers, possessing poor anti-submarine doctrine at this stage, couldn't find her. But Argonaut couldn't catch them. Toughest. It was a stalemate. A frustrating, impotent encounter that served as a prelude to the struggles that would define the next year. Both sides lived to fight another day, but an opportunity to draw first blood had slipped away in the deep blue. But if the situation at Pearl Harbor was tragic, the situation in the Philippines was about to become apocalyptic. For the men of the Asiatic Fleet, there would be no safe harbor to return to. Blockers Navy Bay, the Cavite Navy Yard. This was the forward operating base for the U.S. Asiatic Fleet. It was meant to be the spear tip of American power in the Far East. Instead, it became a trap. On December 10th, 3 days after the devastation at Pearl Harbor, the air raid sirens wailed across Manila Bay. But unlike the low-level torpedo attacks at Pearl, this was different. This was high-altitude precision bombing. Flight after flight of Japanese Mitsubishi bombers drifted overhead. They were high, untouchable, flying in perfect formation. The anti-aircraft guns at Cavite chattered impotently, their shells bursting thousands of feet below the enemy. The bombers didn't even break formation. They simply opened their bays and obliterated the yard. JFK Killen was a sailor aboard the USS Sea Dragon, which was tied up at the dock for a critical overhaul. Tied up right next to her was her sister ship, the USS Sea Lion. Killen recalls the horror of that afternoon vividly. The Japanese wiped out all the airfields, thereby eliminating our air protection. On December the 10th, the Navy Yard was heavily bombed. We did not have a gun that could touch them. The Sea Lion took a 500-pound bomb down the aft torpedo room hatch, sinking her at that instant. The explosion was catastrophic. The bomb didn't just damage the Sea Lion, it gutted her. Shrapnel ripped through the air, tearing holes in the Sea Dragon's superstructure next door. Killen was on the bridge when the bomb hit. The concussion blast picked him up like a rag doll and threw him down the open hatch. I fell onto one of the knobs sticking up, landing full force on the tip of my spine. I lay there, senseless, on the control room deck for quite a while, and then heard the captain yell, "Abandon ship!" In the smoke and ruin, with the practice of temperature during, with Killen taken run in women or gaugeback in relationship, and the nast was really luffed. In the Morstovigent going up from the temperature doom. In the smoke and ruin with the practice of step, and they were faced the different captain killed before temperature. In the temperature doom was to flash out the chiller. In the smoke and ruin with the pectus of stup and telling the datus roaming in and kill. In the smoke and ruin with the Sea Dragon didn't run. They rallied. A salvage ship, the USS Widgeon, braved the fires to pull them clear of the wreck of the Sea Lion. They limped the damaged sub over to Manila, tying up to the submarine tender USS Canopus. For 3 days, they worked like demons. They were fighting against time and the enemy air force. We worked all night long, preparing the boat to once again become seaworthy. During the day, we would have to lie on the bottom of Manila Bay until it turned dark again. The reason for this was that the Japanese chose daylight for their attacks. Imagine that existence, spending the daylight hours sitting on the muddy bottom of the bay in a steel tube, listening to the muffled thumps of bombs destroying the city above you. Then, surfacing in the darkness to weld steel and repair engines by the light of the burning docks. The Sea Dragon was ready. She slipped out of Manila Bay, past the burning forts of Corregidor, past the patrolling Japanese destroyers, and headed south toward the Dutch East Indies. This was the beginning of the Great Skedaddle. The Asiatic fleet was effectively homeless. Their ammunition stocks had largely gone up in smoke. Their maintenance facilities were craters. They were running on coffee, adrenaline, and fear. And they were running into a fight with one hand tied behind their back. Because as the Sea Dragon and others would soon discover,
their primary weapon, the Mark 14 torpedo, was about to betray them in the most heartbreaking way possible. The bravery of the crews was undeniable. They were willing to die to stop the Japanese advance. But the Bureau of Ordnance had sent them to war with a weapon that simply did not work. In the history of naval warfare, few failures are as egregious, as prolonged, or as deadly as the saga of the Mark 14 torpedo. It stands as a monument to bureaucratic arrogance. On paper, the Mark 14 was a marvel of modern engineering. It was designed to solve the problem of heavily armored warships. It featured a secret weapon, the Mark 6 magnetic influence exploder. The theory was seductive. You didn't need to hit the thick armor belt of a battleship directly. Instead, you could fire the torpedo to run under the keel. The magnetic field of the massive steel ship would trigger the detonator as the torpedo passed beneath, exploding the warhead upward. This would break the ship's back, snapping the keel in two. One shot, one kill. But the weapon had been developed during the deepest budget cuts of the Great Depression. To save money, the Navy had rarely tested it with live warheads. They certainly hadn't tested it in the magnetic variations of the equatorial Pacific, or against real targets. As the Asiatic Fleet submarines dispersed to Java and Australia, they began engaging Japanese shipping. The captain set up perfect attacks. They calculated the speed, the range, the gyro angles. They fired. They waited for the boom. And nothing. Killen later recounted one such attack with bitter clarity. We made an approach on a Japanese heavy cruiser. The torpedoes all missed. We were using Mark 14 torpedoes and having trouble with them, as was everybody else. The miss was costly. We were depth-charged pretty heavily. This became the recurring nightmare of 1942. Mark 14 was available to the great. The torpedoes was two-step and said, had we made the death-charged bitty good. The night piece as the develop to the driver. There were 3 distinct, catastrophic problems, though the Navy leadership refused to admit any of them. First, the torpedoes ran too deep. Due to a miscalibration in the pressure sensor, they were running 10 or 12 feet deeper than set. They were passing harmlessly under the targets, never triggering the magnetic exploder. Second, the magnetic exploders were too sensitive. They were triggering prematurely. The torpedo would explode 50 yards from the ship, rattling the enemy crew but doing no structural damage, while simultaneously acting as a giant flare, alerting every destroyer in the area to the sub's exact location. And third, and perhaps most terrifyingly, was the circular run. Imagine the psychological toll on the crews. You risk your life to penetrate a destroyer screen. You endure the heat and the fear. You fire your weapon, and then you hear the sonar pitch of your own torpedo changing, getting louder,
coming back toward you. For the USS Grunion, this nightmare became a fatal reality. In July 1942, the Grunion was patrolling the cold, foggy waters of the Aleutian Islands. She found a target, the cargo ship Kano Maru. The captain fired a spread of 4 torpedoes. The first torpedo ran deep. Useless. The next 2 actually hit the ship. The crew heard the heavy thud of impact against the steel hull, but no explosion. Duds. The 4th torpedo missed, but it didn't just sail off into the horizon. Due to a jammed rudder or a gyro failure, it began to turn. It circled back. A tragic twist of fate, the rogue torpedo looped back and slammed into the periscope supports of the Grunion. It didn't explode. The warhead was likely a dud, too, but the kinetic energy of a 3,000-pound metal tube traveling at 46 knots smashed the submarine's controls and ruptured the hull. The Grunion tumbled below her crush depth and imploded. All hands were lost. It was a loss caused not by enemy brilliance, but by technical failure. Back at Pearl Harbor and in Australia, the rage among the captains was growing. They were reporting these failures, risking court-martial to tell their superiors the truth. They were watching Japanese ships sail away unharmed while they were hunted down by destroyers. But the response from the top was denial. Admiral Withers, commanding the Pacific subs,
And the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington insisted the torpedoes were fine. They blamed the captains. They claimed the crews were firing too deep, or their aim was bad, or they were lacking in aggression. The Bureau even claims that because they hadn't conducted the tests in their Newport lab, the combat reports from the field were invalid. It was bureaucratic arrogance of the highest order, paid for in blood. For men like Alfred Sims, aboard the crumbling S-36, the torpedoes were just one part of a mechanical symphony of disaster. While the newer fleet boats struggled with their torpedoes, the older S-class boats, veterans of the 1920s, were simply struggling to exist. These boats were small, cramped, and obsolete. They had no air conditioning, no modern amenities. They were leaking, rusting buckets of bolts held together by the sheer will of their engineers and the desperate ingenuity of their crews. Alfred Sims was aboard the S-36 during the brutal retreat from the Philippines to Java. His account reads like a descent into hell. During the chase, the depth charging damaged every piece of equipment on my doubtful inventory list. We had severe air leaks. The electrical steering failed. The engine exhaust valve leaked. The port engine air compressor failed. Then the starboard engine seized. It is hard to imagine the physical conditions inside that hull. The temperature soared to 120 degrees. The air was foul with diesel fumes, ozone, and the sour smell of unwashed bodies and fear. The crew, dehydrated and exhausted, worked like dogs to repair machinery that broke again 10 minutes later. Men developed full-body fungal rashes from the humidity. They slipped on oil-slicked decks. When the Japanese destroyers finally gave up and left the area, the S-36 surfaced. But there was no rest. The crew spent the night hand-oiling bearings and patching leaks just to make the boat move. Sims recalled the desperation. I and 2 others crammed ourselves into the motor and bilges and hand-lubricated the shafts. We were only able to make 1/3 speed. They limped into Surabaya, Java. The Dutch allies patched them up as best they could, a catch-as-catch-can repair job using whatever scrap parts were available. And then, they were ordered back out. Pennsylvania. There was no one else. The line had to be held. The S-36 went back into the breach. But the old girl had had enough. In the Makassar Strait, exhausted and blinded by fatigue, the S-36 ran aground on Takabakang Reef. The crew fought to save her, but nature delivered the final blow. We battled to get the boat off the rocks, but chlorine gas from a hole puncture in the forward battery compartment prevented a prolonged effort. Chlorine gas. It is the submariner's worst nightmare. When salt water mixes with the sulfuric acid in the batteries, it creates a deadly yellow-green cloud that burns the lungs and kills in minutes. I felt a certain sadness to see the end of the boat we had struggled so hard to save. I suppose it was just too much for the old girl. She was too tired to keep going. The crew was rescued by a Dutch launch. They watched as their home, their purgatory, slipped beneath the waves. It was a microcosm of the entire Allied effort in early 1942, brave, relentless, but ultimately overwhelmed by the collapse of their equipment and support systems. The ships were sinking. The torpedoes were shipping, so much by the outside of us, and the proof lets flash in the flake. The true were lost. It seemed like the end. But in the darkest hour, leadership began to change. And with new leaders came a new willingness to face the hard truths. By mid-1942, the joke whirled back of a loved treasure, the truth that is one that keeps still previously for flash. The old ships were looking then considering with leadership. By mid-1942, leadership becomes to the questioned with Christ. By mid-1942, the similar leadership came a new willingness to face the hard truths. By mid-1942, the ships were getting everything to save themselves. By too much of the minutes, the ships were precise the rest that developed setter. But a new leadership came a new willingness to face the hard truths. By mid-1942, leadership came a new willingness to face the hard truths. By mid-1942, the ships were continually, by the truth were precise the rest that can build in him. By the truth were bring forth, mitting a flesh and setter, but they want to see their lest in the moment. By mid-1942, the ships were make the minutes just a fun that the literally was more. By mid-1942, the ships were progressive to changed. But a new leadership came a new willingness to face the hard truths. But in the darkest hour, leadership came new willingness to face the hard truths. By the mid-1942, the ships were precise the rest that can build in him. By mid-1942, the ships were precise the rest that can build in him. By mid-1942, the ships were set the timed and the moment. It seems like the proof lets face the hard truths. But in mid-1942, the ships were real traded to face the hard truths. But in mid-1942, the ships were started multiply too lost by the hard truths. By mid-1942, the ships were set the time to the moment. By the two people bring forth becomes the forefling, with the crisis said, that setter is a company. By mid-1942, the ships were real traded to face the hard truths. But in the darkest hour, leadership came a new willingness to face the hard truths. But in the darkest hour, leadership came a new willingness to face the hard truths. By mid-1942, the ships were bring forth becomes the company with literally. And what is the force the time is the moment? They worked to the ship and slipped changed. The ships were not have faced the hard truths. By mid-1942, the ships were precise the rest that can build in him. By mid-1942, the ship's frustration in the submarine force had reached a boiling point. The captains knew the torpedoes were deep runners. They saw the wakes pass under the targets. Admiral Withers refused to listen, prioritizing his career and the Bureau's reputation over the facts. But then, the chessboard shifted. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, a man who actually trusted his subordinates, took command of the submarines in the Southwest Pacific. Lockwood was different. He was a submariner's admiral. When his captains told him the torpedoes were running deep, he didn't call them incompetent. He ran a test. Of practical science born of desperation, Lockwood famously ordered a fishing net set up in a quiet harbor in Australia. He had a submarine fire a torpedo with a dummy warhead right through it. The hole in the net didn't lie. The ships were bring forth becomes the minutes of the force. The chart that enough to be about the submarine student clear them. The torpedoes pierced the net 11 feet deeper than they were set. The evidence was undeniable. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington tried to dispute it, claiming the test was unscientific. Lockwood essentially told them to shove their reports, picked up the phone to Admiral King, the Chief of Naval Operations, and got the authorization to change the settings. But the fight wasn't over. Even after fixing the depth, the magnetic exploders were still failing. Captain John Data of the USS Tuna had finally had enough. After watching torpedo after torpedo fail to detonate against high-value targets, he broke regulations. He ordered his torpedo men to deactivate the secret magnetic exploder. He fired using only the contact detonator. And guess what? He sank the target. Reported this, a blazing row erupted. Admiral Withers was furious at the insubordination, but the results spoke for themselves. The dud rate dropped when the magnetic feature was disabled. Slowly, agonizingly, the truth won out. The magnetic exploders were deactivated. The depth mechanisms were recalibrated, and eventually, the contact exploders, which also turned out to be defective when hitting at a perfect 90-degree angle because the firing pin was too heavy, were fixed in a crash program involving dropping warheads from cranes onto steel plates until they worked. It took 20 months of war, almost 2 years of fighting, to give the U.S. submariners a weapon that actually worked. But by late 1942, the pieces were finally falling into place. The peacetime captains, the cautious men who feared reprimands more than the enemy, were being weeded out. They were replaced by a new breed of aggressive, younger commanders like Richard O'Kane, men who were willing to surface at night, charge into shallow waters, and shoot down the throat of attacking destroyers. The sleeping giant was fully awake, and it was angry. As 1942 ground toward its close, the U.S. submarine force had endured a baptism of fire unlike any other. They had lost bases, ships, and friends. They had fought with broken swords. Unresolved. But they had also learned. They had adapted. Windshield logistics chains were established. The base at Fremantle, Australia was expanded to handle the big fleet boats. A secret refueling stop was set up on the desolate northwest coast of Australia, extending the legs of the hunters by 4 crucial days, allowing them to patrol deeper into the Japanese shipping lanes. The submarines were doing more than just hunting. They were becoming the lifeline of the resistance. They sneaked into the Philippines to offload supplies for guerrilla fighters. They evacuated nurses and carried away the gold reserves from Corregidor before it fell. They acted as navigational beacons for surface fleets and rescued downed airmen from the open ocean. And the Japanese made a fatal mistake. In late 1942, perhaps believing their own propaganda that American subs were ineffective, the Japanese Navy increased the depth settings on their depth charges. They assumed the U.S. boats were diving deeper than they actually were. This change saved countless American lives. Submarines reported depth charges exploding far below them, rattling their teeth and breaking light bulbs, but leaving the pressure hulls intact. The aggression returned. The tonnage numbers began to climb. In the last 3 months of 1942, U.S. subs sank almost as much shipping tonnage as they had in the previous 10 months combined. They were now acting as supply runners for the desperate Marines on Guadalcanal. They were mining enemy harbors, turning safe zones into death traps. The silent service had survived the disaster of the opening act. They had weathered the storm of incompetence, neglect, and superior enemy numbers. The year 1943 was on the horizon. The torpedoes were beginning to work. The new Gato and Balao class boats, stronger, faster, and deadlier, were sliding down the slipways in American shipyards by the dozen. The Japanese merchant marine, the lifeline of the empire, was about to face a stranglehold that would not loosen until the surrender in Tokyo Bay. The hunters had become the hunted. But the story of how the U.S. submarines systematically dismantled the Japanese empire, that is a story for another time. Thanks for watching.
Please don't forget to subscribe for more similar kind of videos.